Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here as we draw towards the final sessions of this conference. I'm going to be moderating a discussion. My name is Robin Shepherd. I'm the Vice President of Halifax International Security Forum, and we'll have four fantastic participants. But before we do, and in a radical departure from usual practice, we're going to actually have a fact-based discussion. So I'd like to invite from GLOBSEC Dominika, Hajdu, and Klingová, who are going to give us some stats and some polling evidence to work with.
Thanks a lot, Robin. Good morning, everyone present here and online. My name is Dominika Hajdu.
My name is Katarína Klingová, and we're researchers from Democracy and Resilience Center at GLOBSEC, in which we focus on protecting democracy and democratic processes against efforts that are trying to undermine them.
And in practice, this means that we study both domestic and foreign actors, the channels through which they operate, the narratives they share, and the impact this all has on the societies.
One of the means that we measure this impact is our public opinion polls that look into public attitudes towards key issues shaping the world.
And that's why we're here. We're actually here to give you a snapshot of the results of our research, which is the latest one. It's called GLOBSEC Trends 2021. You can find it online and also everywhere here around the hotel.
And thus we want to set the tone for the next session on regenerating democracies worldwide.
And to make this a bit more interesting, we would like to start with a poll. So if we could ask you to go to the app and select this stage, which is a Maria Theresia stage, you should already be able to see the first question of the poll, which is actually related to this data from the GLOBSEC Trends.
Yes, so the first question for us to you is, how do you think that the situation in Central and Eastern Europe changed over the past year within the pandemic? Do you think that the support for democracy has increased, or the support for authoritarian leaders has increased? This is actually, in the past 2 years, we asked these questions, whether the respondents in Central and Eastern Europe think that democracy based on equal rights and regular election is good or bad system of governments for the particular country.
And we also asked them whether a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections is good or bad for their country. So we asked two separate questions, this is what the CEE responded.
Yeah, at the moment we have, exactly. As you can see from this chart, it actually is both. And this is one of the dichotomies that we observed, that while 84% of Central and Eastern Europeans think that democracy is a good system of their government, at the same time, 42% of Central and Eastern Europeans think that the strong autocratic leader is as well good for their government.
And actually the support for the autocratic leader has risen by 15% in the last year. And the strongest support, you can see it from the chart, for the strong leadership is in Bulgaria, Romania, and Latvia.
Do we have anybody in the audience, from Romania, from Bulgaria? Yeah. Well, you have a lot of things to do back home when you get back home.
No, but we see this is a dangerous trend which we can observe these days. On one hand, people support democracy. On the other hand, they also have some sympathies towards strong leaders, so towards perhaps other regimes at the same time. So we can now go to the second poll.
Yes, the second question we want to ask you is, whom do Central Europeans trust the most? Is it the national governments? It is the medical authorities and scientists? Is it the media? Or is it armed forces? What do you think?
So while we wait for your answers, we just want to highlight a few of other highlights, a few findings which draw a picture of satisfaction and trust in this region. So for example, 59% of Central and Eastern Europeans believe that their national governments handled the pandemic badly.
And at the same time, 37% of Central and Eastern Europeans believe that the official number of the COVID cases is actually lower than the authorities are telling them. So they think that the national authorities are actually lying.
And yes, you are correctly assuming that the trust in the national governments is low. I think we can actually show the audience the result now. What are the correct answers? Yes, it's armed forces and medical authorities and scientists. Actually, when it comes to national governments, the trust is now at 42% in the entire region. So now actually more people distrust their governments than they trust them. And at the same time, yes, the trust in the media is low, and it actually has decreased also in the past year.
But 72% of Central Europeans believe and trust armed forces, and 68% trust doctors and scientific experts.
So we see that these apolitical institutions and individuals are actually gaining more trust, or are having more trust than the political institutions. So the question is how we cope with such a distrust, and what do we do next?
What policy measures do we need to establish in order to make the situation better?
But the answers luckily are not upon us, but it's our fantastic speakers, which will probably have some answers for us. So let's hear them out, and back to you, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some of those figures are slightly alarming, and I'm going to invite Ivan Krastev and Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović to come to the stage, and I can't let the moment pass for very long, although I will do some introductions first, that Bulgaria seemed to have a penchant for strongman leaders, and Ivan Krastev is from Bulgaria. He's the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, although he's based just an hour's drive away from here in Vienna. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović is the former president of Croatia. And Kolinda, you know, Halifax International Security Forum is based in Washington, D.C., and the word on the street in Washington, D.C. is that you're the front runner to be the next Secretary General of NATO. So in terms of defending our democracies, this is an interesting development. Jens Stoltenberg steps down in September of next year, so we'll be watching this space very closely and very carefully. Remotely, we're joined by Damon Wilson, who is the Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council and soon to be the President of the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States, a very important position. Welcome, Damon. We're also joined, it's a particular pleasure to have somebody from India, by Neelam, who's the Director and Co-founder of Gateway House in New Delhi. So welcome to everybody. This is a great discussion. It's the key discussion of the moment. Unfortunately, it has been the key discussion for many years. And what I'd like to do in this discussion, as much as anything else, is see if we can actually go beyond spending 45 minutes simply lamenting the state of our democracies, having a bit of a whine about populists. We do that all the time. Let's see if we can actually make some concrete suggestions as to how we make the situation better. And I think even more than that, to get to a place where we don't simply dismiss the public, let alone denigrate the public, and take their concerns seriously. I think since we started out with some facts of the matter, I think it's also very important for us to get a sense of what actually is going on in our democracies. And I'm particularly, therefore, pleased to ask the first question to Neelam Deo in New Delhi. India is famously the world's largest democracy. So the question is, how democratic is the world's largest democracy?
So thank you, Robin. I'm delighted to be able to join this discussion. And actually, we are based in Mumbai, not Delhi. And that's a big difference, being out of the heat of a political center. So I would say that India is pretty democratic. We have a leader, the Prime Minister has a popularity rating of over 70%, despite how problematic the second wave of the COVID pandemic has been for India, with high numbers of casualties, or actual breakdown of the health infrastructure. But I think the point to note here is that in India, we have free and fair elections for the federal government as also for the state governments. Although the Prime Minister remains very popular, he has just lost 3 state government elections, and quite resoundingly. And in no case has anybody refused to accept the results of the elections, as we had in the United States, or we have now in Peru or Israel or whatever. People will challenge election results in constituencies, but not the overall result. On the other hand, India suffers from all the things that afflict democracies everywhere. Parliament does not function very well. The judiciary is often accused of being politicized, and sometimes, obviously and rightly so, the media is split between those who are harshly critical of the government and those who can only find things to praise the government about. Police forces in many states are actually quite politicized. The more important thing to my mind is that political mobilization is on the basis of the fissures in our society, religion, caste. There is no political ideology animating our political parties here, just as I do not see any ideology animating politics elsewhere in the world.
Well, Neelam, this is exactly what I was going to ask you. I mean, Mr. Modi's popularity ratings, you said, are somewhere above 70%. Why is he so popular? What is it that Indians, given that it's 70%, this must cut across a lot of the, despite the stereotype, must cut across a lot of the different sections of a very diverse population. Why is he so popular? What do people like about him so much?
I think a couple of factors. One is that political parties in India, as maybe elsewhere, are now owned. They are owned either by money or lobbying powers, or, as in the case of India, by families. The only other real main, All India Party, the Congress Party, belongs to the Gandhi-Nehru family and does not have any very talented politician in that family any longer. So people have what we call the Tina factor. There is no alternative. And the Prime Minister continues to rate higher in terms of who the people want for Prime Minister than he does in a lot of other elements of polls, whether they think the economy is doing well, whether they think the pandemic was handled well. In all of those, the government gets a lower percentage of support, but they get a higher percentage of support because they think there isn't an alternative political party to be able to lead the whole country rather than just some of the state governments where regional parties actually do very well.
Neelam, thank you very much for that overview. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think we'll do a little bit of overviewing for the first 5 or 10 minutes before we go on to, as I said, trying to get to some concrete suggestions as to what we do. Damon Wilson in Washington, D.C., if that's indeed where you are right this second. Damon, American democracy has been under the spotlight. It's always under the spotlight because America is the most important democracy in the world. Let's be clear about that. It is the most influential. It's the one everybody's watching. The racial question, the racial divide in the United States is right at the forefront of the discussion. I live in Washington, D.C. You can't turn on the television news without this being discussed. From the perspective of people like Vladimir Putin, of course, this is a sign of weakness. But actually, the discussion, in my opinion, and I put it to you, is a sign of strength. Insofar as you would agree with that, how do you assess the state of American democracy right now? And is there a real prospect of advancement in these very contentious issues that clearly have and continue to divide the United States of America?
Thank you, Rob. And yes, I am joining from Washington. I wish I were with all of you in person, but it's such a pleasure to be back with the GLOBSEC family and this fantastic panel as well. Robin, I think you're right. What's playing out right now in the United States, it's messy. And you see a lot of debate, a lot of tension, political polarization, sharp social cleavages. And yet, where we began this conversation was with a survey of public opinion, public attitudes. What do our people think? And that is the reality of democracy. That it's a reflection of our people, of their fears, their wants, their desires. And the process of American democracy is messy, but it is a fundamentally one that is a...
I think we just lost in mid-sentence. Let's see if it comes back. All right, we'll go back. We'll come back to Damon. He was making a very important point there. But let's jump in with Ivan Krastev. I did say, and I can't avoid asking you this, with the opinion polling we just saw, the penchant for strongman leadership in Bulgaria looks pretty strong. Is that a fair reflection of what's going on in Bulgaria and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, where Romania was also a country with a high degree of support for the notion of a strongman leader?
Robin, you know, there was this Christian tradition that people who committed suicide should be buried outside of the graveyards. I do believe people who do not read opinion polls should be buried outside of the graveyards, but people who basically read too much in the opinion polls should be buried outside of the graveyards too. We start with the assumptions that people all the time clash the idea of democracy with the idea of the strong leadership. It's not true. You go through a major crisis, and people are looking for strong leaders, but they want these leaders to be elected by them. So from this point of view, if you're going to ask what people are answering, they believe that in the moment of crisis, they have leaders that have certain discretionary powers. This was a poll being done during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. There is a problem with democracy, and there is a dissatisfaction with democracy in Bulgaria, and this is very much there, and you can see this very much happening. It does not mean that people are seeing authoritarian leader and the end of democracy as an alternative. So in a certain way, for me, the real problem in most of our countries is not that authoritarianism is on rise, but the border between democracy and authoritarianism is the least protected border in the region. And you have a level of dissatisfaction. Bulgaria goes for elections. Also, political cycles matters. There was a government that basically was in power for the last 10, 12 years. Listen, nevertheless, how good you are not aging well in power. This is part of the story too. So from this point of view, Bulgaria is ready for change. And this is the most important, in my view, in all our talks. It's not simply democracies in crisis. Modern societies are changing a lot. They're changing demographically, they're changing technologically, they're changing economically, and people cannot make sense of this change. Because for me, what has changed most is people are asked these days to have an opinion about things that they cannot have a personal experience on. Before, 50 or 60% of the things that have been discussed in politics, you have certain personal experience on which you can rely. Now, how I can know what is happening with the coronavirus and so on. And then, of course, this information space, which was totally fragmented and which basically was poisoned, is something that is changing people's perceptions. But with all dissatisfaction, it's not my view that Central and Eastern Europe is basically embracing some type of authoritarian models. Ask people, do you want elections to be banned? And then you're going to see, no. They want to have the power to dismiss the same strong leaders that they're looking for.
Yeah, yes, it's interesting, isn't it? We can certainly find opinion poll evidence which makes us all very depressed, but actually at the end of the day, if you say to people, all right, so you want to really abolish elections and just have a dictator or a monarch or something, nobody actually wants that to happen. Kolinda, I wanted to refer back to the point that I posed to Damon, and Damon will rejoin us when his link's back up. And this is the point about American democracy having such an important signaling function around the world. It's reputationally vital that American democracy is seen to be healthy. From the perspective of Croatia and as a former president, what do you believe the perception of Croats is of American democracy? Do they look at the kind of things I described and think, well, the whole thing is just falling apart? Or do they think, well, look, this is how democracy works? I mean, is America still seen as this sort of shining light on a hill? Or is it seen to be tarnished and people sort of think that, well, you know, American democracy isn't what it used to be?
Well, certainly there have been some setbacks, and you know, we all have to face the fact that America has been the beacon of democracy for all of us and an example. And with the developments last year, it did tarnish a little bit about the American reputation. And I would say everyone else who associates with the US as an example and an ally, because it sort of builds upon your own reputation who you associate with. And a lot of people actually ask me to compare the situation in the US to the former Yugoslavia, which is completely incomparable, because former Yugoslavia was an authoritarian state that fell apart for many different reasons, one of them being that people were not able to express their freedoms. But the way that the US has handled the situation has shown that they've recognized the problems, that during the Trump administration, they didn't didn't become a reality, but they just surfaced from something that was ignored by the elites, I would say, for years and decades. And it was just a catalyst for the problems to come out and to boil up on the surface, causing a number of events, including the public reaction. Now, we're looking towards the US, how they will handle the situation, because the last election, of course, President Biden won. But when you look at the numbers, you cannot just simply dismiss the 74.5 million people who voted Trump. Actually, he got more popular vote than in the first election that he won. So you need to engage them in a dialogue. And this is the responsibility of the so-called political elites. Trump's election in the first place was in part due to the fact that people were resisting the political establishments and the political elites for different reasons that we can discuss further. But the fact that we've seen rifts across societies, it imposes further obligations on politicians, on leadership, not to look at the outside environment as the cause of the grievances or the cause of their problems, but really to look inside and see what is wrong that we have been doing for decades and for years in order to provoke not just populist movements, but third options and alternative movements, because not all of them are necessarily bad for a certain country. And to engage and to discuss those grievances and try to mend the rifts across society. I think that President Biden has taken a very wise approach after he won elections, and especially during his inaugural speech. He pointed out that America is a democracy that has its deficiencies. It's not a perfect union, but a goal is a more perfect union, that it's a healing process, and that they are able to overcome these divides. On this side of the Atlantic, of course, we have huge expectations of President Biden and of the US, and I hope he will have the time and the resources to truly live up to them, because we want to not just restore the transatlantic relationship, but we want to restore the belief in democracy and democratic systems. And we really do not serve our purpose as politicians or as people who, as leaders, if we try to, first of all, resist the fact that we need to change from the ways that we were doing business before, because the world has changed. If we engage in a blame shifting game instead of looking at what we have done that was wrong and that could be remedied, and especially in blaming the public for not understanding or misinterpreting our own actions or our own policies. Additionally, if we paint a picture in our own public appearances and in talking to the public that is not realistic and that does not correspond to actual state of events and the reality of situation in our own countries. So we do have to admit that, yes, there are shortcomings, there are challenges, and we're ready and we need to deal with this. challenges. Additionally, you see that a lot of people have started to resist these traditional establishments and elites simply because people are tired of political dynasties or dynasties, whichever pronunciation you prefer. And if we promise better and equal opportunities for all, we really have to live up to that and be inclusive rather than exclusive. And the fact that, again, I mentioned changed, the information environment has radically changed the way that we do business, both connective and disruptive technologies, not just in science and technology and what pandemics has emphasized the workplace and school, but also politics. And I don't think that the traditional political elites are prepared for that. You know, day-to-day public relations, business, and issuing communiques is not going to help things. We truly need to listen to what the other side, although I'm really against that us and them division. So really to engage that other side, address those grievances, show that you care, and work together to try to find a path forward. And I think this is the best outcome for the US as well. In all of the problems that they have post-pandemic, not just health issues, but economic issues, national reconciliation, to speak, and the path forward in how to engage those who were dissatisfied and were isolated to different shady platforms, how to integrate them, again, in mainstream politics and make it a true functional dialogue.
Kolinda, thanks. You provided a lot of perfectly and aptly provocative points, which I will raise in the sort of next round of questions of what we do and what have we been doing wrong. I wanted to bring back Damon Wilson. Technology intervened against us this time. It's working in our favor generally, today at least. But Damon, we were talking about the question of the restorative power of American democracy and the divides in society just before you got up. Perhaps just go back to where you were before we were interrupted and continue on that theme of American health and strength in the face of obviously problems that everybody's aware of.
Thank you, Robin. We're working on both our democracy and sometimes our technology. Apologies, but good to be back. You captured it with the word restorative. The power of American democracy is that it's self-correcting. We don't need Russian propaganda or Chinese propaganda to point out the shortcomings or fissures or failures of American society. We're pretty good at that. That's the story of our democracy. It's our history. And so, yes, we can't be naive and paper over the challenges to American democracy and society today. It's because we face those challenges head on that our democracy is resilient, and that it gives me a sense of optimism, not naivete, but optimism about American democracy going forward. We started this conversation about being responsive to our publics, and that is the fundamentals of a democracy. And so in the United States, where we had a great recession, where Wall Street recovered before Main Street, we saw exacerbated inequalities, particular racial inequalities, coming out of that unequal, slow recovery, a real devastating impact on our manufacturing base, political gridlock, and concern in the public about our long-term military commitments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It produced a public backlash that said the elites are failing us and we want something different. That's democracy. That is a public being responsive. And we've seen this through some convulsions politically here, but that is the way of a messy process of working through these factors. And so if you think about it a little bit with a historic perspective, I mean, President Eisenhower sent federal troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, when he addressed the nation explaining why he was doing this to address racial inequality and segregation at home. He really cited how could the United States play a leadership role in the free world on the world stage if it can't live up to those values at home. That story continues to unfold in a very different way, but with some interesting parallels. And the United States makes it through the '68 protests, the Nixon impeachment, Velez, and the Carter administration with the restorative process. And so it's not easy and it's not clean, but that's what's playing out right now in the United States, which gives me a sense of optimism that renewal at home in the United States and renewal across democracies in the West is fundamentally tied to the topic of this conversation. Showing that democracy can deliver for its people and the great democracies, I think, is a key ingredient to be a catalyst for the advance of democracy more globally.
Damon, I wonder, I'm moving into this question of what we actually do, and obviously if we're going to do something sensible, we have to be aware of where the problems actually lie. You've mentioned certain events and the way that elites responded to the events. I mean, we had the Iraq War, and we had the question of weapons of mass destruction. In my opinion, pretty much every discussion is it sort of looms as a shadow over the American public. And I think what happened then a few years later in 2008 with the Great Recession, when it was seen that a lot of people suffered, but not the people who had actually caused the problem. Bankers' bonuses famously continued for many years. Very few people, there were a couple of fall guys, but very few people actually lost their jobs. I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, there is this restorative power of American democracy and democracy generally, but to what extent are the problems, deeper than that are actually structural? I mean, the United States famously is constructed through a constitution in the 18th century. It was against the backdrop of technological and social realities which prevailed in the 18th century, not the 21st century. Is there any sense in which American democracy is actually outdated? And in order to really move forward, there's going to have to be a massive new rethink of how democracy is done.
Look, I think American institutions, the Constitution, the institutions that flow from it, the checks and balances has been one of the great one of the great infrastructures that has led to America's success and America's power. I think part of what we've been grappling with is how that system has been driven by money and politics towards more political polarization and an incentives behind blockage, obstacles, gridlock. And so that's where we see a fervent debate today, and we're responding. The expansion of ranked choice voting across the United States, the increasing presence of nonpartisan primaries, and yet it still is faced with the counterwinds of money and politics and gerrymandering of districts, but we're working through that. Are there structural challenges? Of course there are, but that's been part of our history here. It doesn't mean that we have a wholesale default problem of our democracy that we need to turn our back on. It means we need to be committed to the relentless process of helping to improve it, make it more effective, and adapt it for modern circumstances. And that's what we see move forward. In 2 steps forward, 1 step back, fits and starts, political balance. But I'm not overly concerned that we've got a structural dysfunction that takes the United States out of the game. We're coming out of this pandemic, vaccinating our population, opening the economy, unprecedented rates of economic growth, and one of the healthiest debates on racial inequality that we've had that is going to lead to change and progress, and unprecedented historic investments in structural issues around infrastructure, around our democracy. It won't be linear, it won't be clean, but the concept of renewal at home, fueling a way to renew democratic leadership on the world stage, that's a direct connection between what's happening domestically here and internationally on the world stage.
Neelam, in India, you don't quite have the history of the United States of almost 2.5 centuries now of constitutional democracy. But I mean, India is it's incredible, I think, to many people that Indian democracy functions as well as it does, given how diverse a society and how enormous the society is. Is there a conversation going on in India about renewal and in fact structural change of the way democracy is done? My sense is that what Damon said is actually true of most democracies. There isn't, amongst the elites, there isn't really a conversation about actually changing the way democracy is done. For example, really integrating the digital revolution into the decision-making process. Everybody's interested in communication through the digital revolution, but there aren't many people around talking about, a sort of digital national assembly or something like that. Where is the debate in India about how democracy actually can or should, or maybe should not, develop?
So I would say there's not much of a conversation because people are really shouting at each other. So the ones who don't like the way things are going, finding fault with everything. And then there are those who think, this is great. I think I would say that Damon is probably right in terms of saying that at this moment, the United States is having the most interesting conversation about race. But I would have to say that after 400 years, if they're still having a conversation and the situation relating to race, it's discouraging. Just like in India, it's very discouraging that we have not been able to move ahead on caste-related issues, and caste has become a big factor of political mobilization. Similarly, religion, which was not a factor for political mobilization in India, has become a really deep fissure now. Maybe because we didn't discuss it and we wanted to bury the fact that the partition of the country was based on religion. And for many years, nobody wanted to talk about it. I mean, my parents are refugees from what is now Pakistan. And my family never wanted to discuss the partition, why it happened, how it happened, what kind of deep trauma was inflicted on various people. So I'd say we are all at different spaces, whether it's the United States or Eastern Europe or wherever. And it's very important to recognize these massive differences and not try and comprehend democracy as if there were a one size that fits all. We are at different stages of economic prosperity, of race relations, of religious strife, in fact, or, so in India, we are actually not having a very reasoned, fundamental conversation because we're still at the stage of shouting at each other. And I'm actually beginning to wonder whether we need to continue to deify the people. Democracies are now talking about the people in the same way as the Marxists used to. And you will all remember that it was said that, Marxism likes the people, it just doesn't like you. So I think we need to understand why is it that a majority of people in all our countries are voting the way they do. And the voting, mostly, I would say, even with all the challenges, gives us the results that it would, even if there are issues here and there. Why is it that people vote the way they do? What is it that is? It's not just a case of saying that we have to talk to the people. The people don't want to talk to you is the situation at the moment.
I'm said, and I think we all agree, that the fate of American democracy is vital to the whole democratic project across the world. But India is also vital to that project. I mean, partly because it's the largest single democracy, and also it shows that democracy can be done in a very diverse society. It's also the case, of course, that in Asia there is a competing rival system for development, namely by communist China. Ivan, I wonder how important you think that the development, success, failures of Indian democracy are to the wider question of how democracy is perceived in the world today.
So let's be very frank. I don't believe that the fate of Indian democracy is what is going to shape the opinion of Bulgarian voters about democracy. India is extremely important in a geopolitical context, but people are much more local and provincial and know basically democracy that they know. United States is different because of the fact that basically everybody, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, when they talk about democracy, was imagining the United States. And the biggest thing that happened in the United States, honestly speaking, is contesting the election results. It's not how people are voting. In democracy, it's very important how parties are losing elections. But while India is very important on one theoretical level, listen, people look the world that they know. And of course, knowing that India is a democracy is very important, but I don't believe this is shaping Bulgarian voters. Also, I do believe that, strangely enough, we try to believe that if there is a crisis of democracy, this is the same crisis. And listen, you can be in a crisis for different reasons, based on different experiences. And for me, there are two things talking about what is happening and not happening that probably are important and we're not talking a lot about. Our societies, particularly in Europe, are going to go through a major demographic change. We don't know how to talk about demography. From this point of view, pandemic was critically important. I'm going to give you South Korean numbers in order not just to stay East European, to tell you what is going to happen in the next 30, 40 years if we basically trust demographers. So in 30 years, the population of South Korea, when a very well functioning and prosperous Asian democracy, is going to lose half of its population because basically they have less than one child per woman. 40% of people in South Korea today live in a single household. You have basically the new generation, which have a totally different experience. And I'm saying this not because it's good or bad, but because this is changing incredibly the way all this functions. Imagine that in 30 years in Bulgaria, most probably, 30% of the people on the labor market are not going to have a voting rights because they're not going to be Bulgarian citizens. At the same time, probably 15% of the Bulgarian citizens are going to live out of the country, so they're going to vote, but they're not going to pay taxes in the country. And 40% of the voters are going to be on the retirement age. At this very moment, 40% of people living in Vienna could not vote on the votes for the mayor of Vienna. It's not that we don't have political rights. I have my political rights in Bulgaria. I'm voting there, but you're living in Vienna most of the time. And from this point of view, these changes is totally changing the way democracy functions. And I do believe we should be very much open to this kind of a bigger trends. Aging of the population, major divorce between the labor market and body politics, because it is not true that Eastern Europe is closed to foreigners. Do you know which was the European Union member states that got most labor migrants for the last 3 years before migration? Poland. So all these trends are there, but when we talk about democracy, we try to imagine that it is going to look like as if before the crisis. In the way our economy is not going to look the same. You cannot simply forget that digital things happened. Our democratic societies are changing, and I'm going to end up on this. One of the biggest problems that I see, particularly for Central and Eastern Europe, is a major generational divide that is open as a result of it. Younger generation is a small cohort. They don't have the numbers. And people don't like to play games in which they cannot win. If you're a young person and basically you want to go for change in your country, you have two options. One is to go through change through the ballot boxes. If this is not happened, either you're going to stay on the street most of the time, basically try to show that what is important for him should happen, or you're going to leave the country. And believe me, leaving the country is much easier than the two previous options. So from this point of view, I do believe probably we should think about reducing the voting age. We should try to see how these major generational disbalances are going to be taken with. Because the last point of facts and type of a polling facts is that if you try to see the results of the Cambridge University Institute for the Future of Democracy, which was done in 2020, the younger people in the world are the one most dissatisfied with the performance of democracy. And millennials are much more dissatisfied than the previous generations on the same age. So from this point of view, there is a big youth problem, but not simply in terms of the economy, but on the terms of political representation. And this is a very distinctive generation. Listen, they have been born in a digital world. They experience the world differently than us. So trying to empower the younger generation politically, in my view, is one of the major things that should happen.
I think that this discussion is immensely rich and it's multidimensional. I think we've got sort of 7 minutes left or so. I think we need to introduce another really big dimension to this discussion. I mean, I remember I'm a child of the 1980s. in the sense I wasn't born in the 1980s, unfortunately, but I achieved my sort of political maturity in the 1980s and the tail end of the Cold War. And one of the arguments that you will hear in this discussion as to why populations in established democracies have kind of lost a certain amount of faith is because, unlike the generation, I'm talking about the millennials prior to the millennials, people grew up with a very clear alternative. You knew that there was this totalitarian empire, and you knew it was very unpleasant to live there if you wanted to hold different opinions or if you wouldn't simply follow the ideology of a totalitarian system. And then that kind of disappeared through the 90s and 2000s, and there was really no, there was only one way to look about democracy, really, and it was inwards. And people, because it's in the nature of democracy to be critical, became self-critical and perhaps went too much in that direction and failed to recognize the value of what they had. But now, of course, we do have a major neo-authoritarian rival in the form of China. I wonder, Kolinda, whether you believe that, not that anyone would wish it to happen, but given that there is this colossus out there in Asia, which has a very different way of running a society, is that a kind of, a sort of lodestar, and it makes actual unity and a renewed sense of the value of what we have easier to sell to our populations?
Well, when we look at our own region, people don't perceive China as much of a factor in terms of an example, whether we talk about the system or democracy. They just perceive China as this huge country who is becoming a player on world stage, and there is desire, I think, on part of the population to make that relationship, in terms of cooperation, competition, confrontation that is put in the context of the relationship with China towards more cooperation. And of course, people want security in their life and stability. And this is why when you look at the polling results that we saw earlier, that the most trusted institutions are the armed forces, the security forces. And partially the reason why we're seeing all of these developments is the sense of loss of control, which always provokes fear. And then there is tendency in some countries to look at an autocratic form of government as being more efficient in dealing with the current problems, because they don't have the requirement of going through sometimes a lengthy parliamentary procedure process, etc. And of course, most people want to see their problems solved overnight. Everybody wants a better life. And in thinking about that, they're also questioning the value of democracy, which we cannot ascribe to any geopolitical or geographical regions of talking about Western democracy or Indian democracy, etc. We have these common and universal democratic values that need to be upheld. But why are why are people losing trust in government and institutions in general? It's the fact that, as I said, they want to see change overnight, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. I think we're still not happy with the level of convergence that we have achieved with the rest of the European Union. So the efficiency of the governments is questioned in terms of not just democratic reform, but also being able to implement the funding from the EU, building infrastructure, and really providing for circumstances for people to change. Ivan has mentioned demographic shifts, and they are really quite worrisome. In most of our countries, young people are leaving countries, not just for the lack of opportunities, but also for disappointment that they feel in the system. And one of the reasons being that we still have not dealt with corruption in an appropriate way. We tend to single out some cases and focus on them, but I haven't seen really a systematic attempt to deal with corruption at all levels in our societies. And secondly, it's nepotism. I asked a lot of young people around the world who come from Croatia, would you return to Croatia? And they say, yes, we would. And we would accept even a smaller salary and a lower standard of living that we get in some other countries. But the problem is that we know that we will not get an equal chance, an equal opportunity to compete for a job. That nepotism is still there. That there are some people who are preordained for certain functions. So that's the problem of the elites, that they feel they have the inherent right to power.
Yes, and I think that this is a problem. I mean, actually, I spoke to Francis Fukuyama yesterday on a panel, and he's also referred to the sense of a gilded insider class, which is very dangerous for democracy, as you say, because if people feel that there is no way that they can make it through, then this is where they start sort of gestating on the ideas and feeling and looking inwards. We literally have we have less than 1 minute left. But I'm going to expand for just 1 minute, and to ask everybody very briefly. I wish this conversation could have gone on for 2 hours. Do you expect, in a yes or no answer, which you can extend to 15 seconds? I'll start with Neelam. Do you expect that by mid-century, democracy will be in a healthier or less healthy state, globally that is, and you can talk about your own country, than it is today? In 15 seconds, Neelam.
So I think it can be in a healthier state if we are willing to look inwards and examine some of our prejudices, and to be able to concentrate our energies on addressing problems in small bits. In India, we remember always that Gandhi had propagated village republics because the macro system has failed us. The UN Security Council is neither representative nor does it function. It could not meet for the current pandemic. So yes, it can be better.
Well, Neelam, I did a handbook for democracies, China versus democracy, and I recommended that India should be a permanent member of the Security Council, so we're friends, I guess. Damon, again, in 15 seconds, do you believe that by mid-century, democracy globally and in the United States will be healthier or less healthy than it is today?
I do believe it will be healthier. We are going through a wrenching process of self-correction, which is essentially renewal. And part of what that can do is catalyze renewal at home so that we can work together as a free world to end this democratic recession, 15 years of democratic recession, an opportunity to turn the tables on the authoritarian march and to catalyze a new democratic wave. But we start by showing that democracy delivers at home. We show that the free societies, free world can work together to counter the authoritarians. And we've got to stand together in supporting those small d Democrats on the front lines of freedom. And that's a strategy for optimism, for renewal, for democracy being in a better place in mid-century.
Well, I'm great that you'll be bringing that message and that way of looking at the world to the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an immensely important institution. And congratulations again on the new job. Ivan, Bulgarians are notoriously quite pessimistic people, aren't they? So are you going to fulfill the national stereotype, or are you also going to be optimistic about prospects for democracy by mid-century?
Listen, it's going to be better in some places and worse on others.
Okay, that's hedging the bets. Kolinda?
Oh, I'm an absolute believer in democracy. To me, there is no alternative, and I think that most people want democracy and the benefits of democracy, but we have to be willing and able to adapt to the changing circumstances in the world and react to that and be proactive rather than trying to justify what we have done with again, as I said, painting the reality that is different from what people feel.
I'm taking this as an optimistic way to end the panel, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, whether remotely in the audience, and most particularly to the 4 members of the panel for making such a great discussion in such a short period of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
And I just